They say history is written by the winners, but in the military, history is written in blood by those who didn't listen. In 1953, the elite French Expeditionary Corps made a fatal bet in a valley called Dien Bien Phu. They built a trap for themselves, surrounded by mountains they thought the enemy could never climb. 60 years later, in the suffocating heat of the Al-Zab Pass, a modern American command ignored the ghosts of the past. They sent a thin, unreinforced supply line into a natural kill zone with no air cover, no recon, and zero local intel. They called it a routine mission. Private Sarah Ghost Miller called it a death sentence. Because as the silence of the mountains began to scream, she realized they weren't just walking into an ambush, they were walking into a historical massacre. The air inside the Tactical Operations Center, the TOC, was a sharp, artificial chill that felt like a slap against the skin. It was a world of glowing blue screens, humming servers, and the smell of ozone and expensive espresso. Here, the war wasn't fought with mud and lead. It was fought with PowerPoint slides and satellite overlays. Major Harrison stood at the center of this digital fortress, his uniform crisp, his boots polished to a mirror shine that had never touched the jagged rocks of the Al-Zab Valley. With a flick of his wrist, Harrison swiped a finger across a massive 80-inch touchscreen. The topography of the region flattened into a harmless 3D model. To the men and women in the dirt, those ridges were jagged teeth capable of hiding 1,000 insurgents. To Harrison, they were merely geographic constraints. "The sector is green," Harrison's voice echoed with the hollow confidence of a man who trusts math over instinct. "Our latest thermal sweeps show 0 heat signatures in the primary transit corridor. The local tribes have been pacified by the recent civil aid drops. According to the horizontal logic of our current strategy, the insurgent elements have retreated to the northern highlands to regroup. This gives us a window." Standing in the back, leaning against a cold metal crate, Sarah Miller felt a slow, poisonous dread creeping up her spine. She was a sniper, a ghost. Her entire life was built on observing the things that weren't there. She had spent the last 72 hours belly down on a ridge overlooking that very pass. Her eyes were bloodshot from staring through a Schmidt and Bender optic, searching for the slightest ripple in the heat haze. "Major," Sarah interrupted. Her voice was low, raspy from the desert dust, and it cut through the room's humming silence like a knife. Harrison paused, his finger hovering over a button that would authorize the movement of 40 unarmored supply trucks. He didn't turn around. "Something to add, Private Miller?" "The thermals are lying to you, sir," Sarah said, stepping into the blue light of the monitors. "It's 115 degrees in that valley. The rocks hold enough heat to ghost any signature smaller than a tank. And the pacified tribes, they stopped grazing their livestock near the pass 3 days ago. In this country, when the shepherds leave, the wolves move in. We are sending the 507th Supply Co. into a funnel. It's Dien Bien Phu all over again." The room went silent. The mention of 1953 was a curse. At Dien Bien Phu, French General Navarre had committed the ultimate military sin. He placed his base in a basin, surrounded by high ground, believing his superior artillery and air power would make the terrain irrelevant. He believed his modern army was untouchable by peasant forces. He was wrong. The Viet Minh had hauled heavy artillery up those impossible cliffs by hand, piece by piece, and turned the French base into a slaughterhouse. Harrison finally turned, a thin, condescending smile playing on his lips. "This isn't the jungle of Indochina, Miller, and we aren't the 1950s French army. We have GPS, we have encrypted comms, and we have the most advanced logistics chain in human history. The 507th is a support unit. They don't need a heavy escort for a cleared route. Air cover is currently diverted to the northern offensive. We aren't wasting fuel to babysit a convoy through a quiet sector. It's quiet because they're waiting, sir," Sarah countered, her heart hammering against her ribs. If that convoy takes a wrong turn, if a single engine stalls, they have no air cover, no recon, and no armored help. We're 45 minutes away from the nearest QRF, at best. In a mountain ambush, 45 minutes is an eternity. It's the same arrogance that led to the ambush in Nasiriyah in 2003. We figured the enemy would just go away. They didn't. Enough, Harrison snapped. The arrogance in his eyes was blinding. The mission is a go. The convoy departs at 0500. Miller, since you're so concerned with the terrain, you'll be riding in the lead Humvee as eyes on. Dismissed. As Sarah walked out of the TOC and into the brutal early morning heat of the base, the smell of JP-8 jet fuel hung heavy in the air. She saw the trucks of the 507th lining up. These weren't frontline combat vehicles. They were soft-skinned trucks filled with water, food, and ammunition. The drivers were kids, 20-year-olds from small towns who believed the Major's maps were the truth. She looked toward the horizon, where the mountains rose like the walls of a fortress. The Al-Zab Pass was a narrow slit in the earth, a place where the sun only reached the bottom for 3 hours a day. It was a natural ambush point, a place where a single downed truck could turn a 5-mile convoy into a graveyard. She climbed into the lead Humvee, checking the bolt on her 338 Lapua. Beside her, a young corporal named Jenkins was whistling a tune, oblivious to the weight of the silence coming from the peaks. "Beautiful morning, Ghost," Jenkins joked, patting the steering wheel. "Command says we'll be back by dinner. Clear skies and open roads, right?" Sarah didn't answer. She looked at the mountain pass ahead, and for a fleeting second, she didn't see the desert. She saw the misty valleys of Vietnam. She saw the burning wrecks of Nasiriyah. She felt the weight of $4 trillion spent on a war that never learned its own lessons. The engines roared to life, a low, rhythmic thrum that sounded like a funeral drum. The convoy began to move, snaking out of the wire and toward the mouth of the valley. As the shadow of the first cliff fell over the lead vehicle, Sarah Ghost Miller felt the temperature drop. The trap was open, and they were driving right into the center of it. The transition from the open desert into the mouth of the Al-Zab Pass was like passing through a portal into another world. The horizon vanished, swallowed by towering limestone cliffs that bled a sickly pale yellow under the mounting sun. As the lead Humvee entered the shadows, the temperature dropped 10 degrees instantly, but the air felt heavier, thick with the smell of ancient dust and diesel exhaust. Sarah Ghost Miller sat in the passenger seat, her body swaying rhythmically with the lurch of the vehicle. Her rifle, a precision-engineered tool of destruction, rested across her lap like a living thing. She didn't look at the road. Her eyes were fixed on the skyline, the jagged rim where the cliff tops met the burning blue sky. "Static," Sarah muttered into her comms. "Jenkins, slow it down. You're gapping the trucks behind us." Jenkins, the young corporal whose optimism seemed as bright as his freshly pressed tan camo, let out a short laugh. "Orders were to maintain 25 miles per hour, Ghost. The Major wants this delivery made before the midday heat spikes. We stay on schedule, we stay safe. That's the vertical logic, remember?" "Logic doesn't keep you alive in a funnel," Sarah snapped. She keyed her radio to the convoy frequency. "All units, this is lead. Close up the intervals. Keep your eyes on the high ground. If you see movement, you call it out. Do not wait for permission to engage if you see a muzzle flash." A crackle of static was her only reply, followed by a lazy, "Copy that, lead," from a driver 3 miles back. They were bored. They were tired. They were the products of a command structure that had spent years telling them the enemy was defeated and depleted. Sarah looked up. The walls of the pass were closing in, the narrow road barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass each other. This was the exact physical manifestation of the Dien Bien Phu disaster. In 1953, the French had occupied the valley floor, thinking their artillery could sweep the hills. They hadn't realized that the enemy was already in the hills, looking down into their souls. She remembered the comment from the veteran she had read once. They placed their base in a valley surrounded by mountains. The NVA made their lives a living hell. That same terrifying geometry was repeating itself here. Every inch they drove deeper into the pass, their exit became a smaller and smaller dot in the rearview mirror. "Jenkins," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Look at the birds." Jenkins squinted through the dusty windshield. "What birds? I don't see anything." "Exactly," Sarah said. 10 minutes ago, there were vultures and crows circling the peaks. Now, nothing. The sky is empty. Something pushed them off those ridges. She reached for her binoculars, stabilizing her elbows against the vibrating dashboard. She scanned a cluster of boulders 500 feet up the eastern wall. For a second, she saw it. A tiny, unnatural glint of light. It wasn't the jagged reflection of mica or quartz. It was the dull, circular flash of a glass lens.
"Contact!" Sarah yelled, the word tearing through the cabin. "Reverse! Jenkins, get us out of the funnel! Now!" But it was too late. The silence of the valley was shattered not by a scream, but by the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of heavy machine gun fire from above. A streak of white smoke ignited from a hidden crevice on the western ridge, an RPG-7, the signature weapon of the insurgent, the spiritual successor to the mortars that broke the French. The rocket screamed across the narrow gap, trailing a spiraling tail of gray smoke. It didn't hit the lead Humvee. It flew over their heads, striking the third truck in the line, a massive fuel tanker. The explosion was a physical wall of sound and heat. The tanker didn't just burn, it turned into a tactical sun. A pillar of fire roared 60 feet into the air, instantly melting the asphalt and sending a shockwave that shattered the windows of the vehicles around it. The tanker groaned, its frame twisting like a dying animal before it settled across the narrow road, completely blocking the path forward and back. "Ambush! Ambush! Ambush!" The radio exploded with panicked voices, screams for help, and the frantic barking of NCOs trying to regain control. "Jenkins, move!" Sarah screamed, but Jenkins was frozen. His hands were locked on the steering wheel, his eyes wide as he watched the fire in the rearview mirror. Sarah grabbed the wheel, shoving him aside and slamming her foot over his onto the brake as a second RPG struck the cliffside just above them, raining jagged shrapnel and boulders onto the hood of the Humvee. "Look at me, Corporal." Sarah grabbed Jenkins by the tactical vest, shaking him. "Get your head in the game, or we die here. Get behind the engine block. Out, out, out!" They tumbled out of the Humvee as the air turned into a leaden hail of 7.62 millimeter rounds. The arrogant commanders back at the TOC had promised no resistance. They had promised a clear route. But as Sarah looked up, she saw the ridges crawling with movement. This wasn't a hit-and-run militia. This was a coordinated, high-ground massacre. The convoy was now a 3-mile-long serpent trapped in a stone box. No air cover was coming for at least 45 minutes. No armor was close enough to break the line. They were alone in the Valley of Shadows, and the enemy was just getting started. Sarah crawled to the edge of the Humvee, her sniper rifle held tight. She looked through the scope, her breathing slowing by sheer force of will. She saw a bearded man in a checkered scarf adjusting a heavy machine gun on a ledge 300 yards up. "You want history?" Sarah whispered through gritted teeth as she aligned her crosshairs on his chest. "I'll give you history." She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, a sharp, familiar punch. The man on the ledge vanished in a puff of pink mist. 1 down, 200 to go, and the sun was only getting higher. The valley had become a furnace of sound. Every shot fired by the insurgents from the high ridges was amplified by the limestone walls, creating a terrifying echo that made it seem as if the enemy was everywhere, above, behind, and inside the very stone itself. For the soldiers of the 507th Supply Co. trapped below, the world had shrunk to the size of a tire or a discarded crate. Sarah Miller pressed her cheek against the cold, scarred stock of her rifle.
The heat from the burning fuel tanker 50 yards behind her was melting the plastic of her tactical headset, but she didn't move. She couldn't. To move was to be seen, and to be seen in this valley was to die. "Command, this is Ghost Lead," Sarah screamed into her radio, her voice competing with the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of an insurgent DSHK heavy machine gun. "We have a massive ambush in the Al-Zab pass. Tanker is down, road is blocked. We are taking heavy fire from both ridges, requesting immediate close air support. I repeat, where is our air cover?" A voice crackled back through the static, calm, distant, and sickeningly professional. It was the voice of a controller sitting in a cooled room thousands of miles away. "Ghost Lead, be advised. Nearest CAS assets are currently engaged in the northern sector offensive. Redirection authorization is pending Major Harrison's approval. ETA is 45 minutes. Please maintain your current position and establish a defensive perimeter." "Maintain position?" Sarah roared, a stray bullet sparking off the pavement inches from her hand. "We are in a stone coffin. If you don't get birds in the air in 5 minutes, there won't be a perimeter left to defend. Tell Harrison to look at the history books. Tell him Nasiriyah is happening again." She cut the comms. She didn't have 45 minutes. No one did. Beside her, Corporal Jenkins was curled into a ball, his hands over his ears. The arrogance of their training had prepared them for asymmetric warfare, where the U.S. always held the high ground. It hadn't prepared them for the raw, primitive brutality of being outpositioned by an enemy who used gravity as a weapon. "Jenkins, get your rifle up!" She kicked his boot. "They're going to start coming down those cliffs soon. If they get to the road, it's over. Look through your sights and watch the 6 o'clock ridge." Sarah peered through her own scope again. She had to find the command and control of this ambush. Insurgents didn't just stumble into a perfect trap like this. They were led. She scanned the highest peak, a jagged crown of rock nearly 800 feet above. There, she saw him. A man in a dark green jacket, holding a radio and a pair of high-end binoculars. He wasn't shooting. He was directing. He was the conductor of this massacre. "I see you, you bastard," Sarah whispered. She adjusted her turret for the extreme incline and the shifting wind of the valley. In a mountain pass, wind doesn't blow straight. It swirls in a vortex effect. She had to aim 3 feet to the left and 2 feet above his head to account for the drop and the air currents. She took a breath, held half of it, and felt her heart beat. Thump, thump, thump. Between the beats, she squeezed. The rifle roared, the muzzle brake kicking up a cloud of dust that momentarily blinded her. 800 feet up, the man in the green jacket vanished. His binoculars tumbled down the cliffside, bouncing off the rocks for hundreds of feet before shattering on the valley floor. The insurgent fire faltered for a second. The music had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. "They're stopping?" Jenkins asked, his head peeking over the Humvee's bumper. "Did they run out of ammo?" "No," Sarah said, her eyes wide as she saw movement in the rocks closer to the road. "They're not stopping. They're changing tactics. They realize the tanker is the anchor. They're moving in for the kill." Suddenly, a series of whistles echoed from the cliffs, a primitive, chilling sound that signaled a mass descent. Dozens of insurgents began sliding down the scree slopes, moving with a terrifying agility that no soldier in heavy body armor could match. They were closing the gap, moving from the high ground to the road to finish the job with grenades and point-blank fire. This was the living hell the commenter had mentioned. The NVA had done this to the French at Dien Bien Phu, not just shooting from a distance, but digging in, moving closer, and suffocating the trapped unit until there was nowhere left to hide. Sarah looked at her watch. Only 7 minutes had passed since the first RPG hit. She still had 38 minutes of eternity left. "Jenkins, get the saw off the turret," Sarah commanded. "We can't hold them with a sniper rifle anymore. We need volume. We need to make them think there's an entire platoon down here." She looked back down the long line of the convoy. Smoke was rising from 5 different locations. Soldiers were hiding under trucks, their faces pale, their eyes looking up at the mountains like they were looking at the face of God. The vertical logic of Major Harrison had failed. The map was a lie. As the first insurgent hit the valley floor only 50 yards away, screaming a war cry that chilled Sarah to her marrow, she realized she wasn't just fighting for a supply route anymore. She was fighting to prove that history didn't have to end in a massacre every single time. She dropped her sniper rifle and drew her sidearm, her eyes locking onto the tall, jagged silhouette of the mountain. "Not today," she hissed. "Today, the valley belongs to me." The air in the Al-Zab pass was no longer just air. It was a pressurized mixture of pulverized stone, vaporized diesel, and the metallic tang of blood. The heat from the burning tanker had reached such an intensity that the rubber on Sarah's tactical boots was beginning to soften. But the environmental heat was nothing compared to the psychological pressure crushing the convoy. As the insurgents descended from the ridges, Sarah was struck by a terrifying sense of déjà vu. She wasn't just in the Middle East. Her mind was flickering back to the archives she had studied, the 507th Maintenance Company in Nasiriyah 2003. Back then, a wrong turn in a city they thought was pacified had led to a massacre. 11 soldiers killed, several captured, including Jessica Lynch. The military leadership back then had figured the Iraqi militia would simply go away. They were wrong. "They're using the Nasiriyah playbook!" Sarah shouted over the roar of a nearby explosion. Jenkins, now gripping the saw machine gun with white-knuckled intensity, looked at her with hollow eyes. "What does that mean, Ghost?" "It means they don't want to just shoot us from the hills anymore," Sarah replied, slamming a fresh magazine into her sidearm. "They want to split the convoy. They want to isolate the trucks, take prisoners, and turn this into a political nightmare. They know we have no air cover. They know we're 45 minutes from help. They're counting on our arrogant command to stay paralyzed." Suddenly, the lead Humvee rocked violently as a grenade detonated near the front tire. Through the smoke, 3 insurgents emerged, moving with frantic, desperate speed. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were ghosts of the valley, fueled by a local knowledge that no satellite could map. Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped out from behind the engine block, her sidearm barking 3 times in rapid succession. The first insurgent fell, but the other 2 dove behind a discarded crate of rations. "Jenkins, suppress them! Left side, 10 o'clock!" The saw opened up, a continuous, deafening chatter that sent a stream of tracer rounds into the rocks. But Jenkins was firing blindly. He was a victim of the computer story training. He expected the enemy to stay in the open like targets on a range. He didn't understand that these men moved through the terrain like water. "Command, this is Ghost Lead!" Sarah screamed into her radio again, the desperation finally breaking through her professional veneer. "We have boots on the ground, close quarters engagement. If you don't authorize a strike now, you are going to lose the entire 507th. Do you copy? Harrison, are you listening?" Back at the TOC, Major Harrison sat in stunned silence. The glowing blue map was no longer green. It was flashing red. The vertical logic was crumbling. He had spent $4 trillion on a military machine that was currently being dismantled by men with 30-year-old rifles because he had forgotten that a valley is a trap, not a transit route. "Major?" a young technician whispered, her face pale. "The 507th is reporting 50% casualties in the rear elements. Sarah Miller is the only one still transmitting from the front. She's calling for air cover, but the jets are still 20 minutes out."
Harrison looked at the screen. He saw the icons of his soldiers flickering and going dark. He realized, too late, that he had played into the exact hands of history. He had trusted recent quietness. He had trusted modern tech. He had ignored the warning of Dien Bien Phu. Back in the valley, Sarah was down to her last 2 magazines. The insurgents were now within 20 yards. She could hear their breathing, their shouts, the clatter of their gear. "Ghost, I'm out! I'm dry!" Jenkins screamed, his machine gun clicking on an empty chamber. Sarah looked at him. He was bleeding from a shrapnel wound on his forehead, his face covered in a mask of red and dust. He looked like the soldiers in the Nasiriyah photos, lost, abandoned by a leadership that figured the enemy would just go away. "Fix bayonets," Sarah said, her voice eerily calm. "What?" Jenkins stammered. "You heard me. If we're going to be a deadly lesson for the history books, we're going to make them pay for every damn page." She stood up, silhouetted against the fire of the burning tanker. Behind her, the mountains loomed like silent judges. She wasn't just a sniper anymore. She was the personification of every soldier ever left behind in a valley from 1953 to 2003. As the insurgents surged forward for their final rush, a new sound began to vibrate through the canyon walls. It wasn't the thump of a machine gun or the scream of an RPG. It was a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Sarah looked up. A tiny speck of silver was cutting through the heat haze at the far end of the pass. "Help is 45 minutes away," Sarah whispered, a grim smile touching her lips. "But I think history just decided to arrive early." The sound Sarah heard wasn't the high-pitched scream of a jet engine. It was the low, chest-thumping beat of a lone AH-64 Apache. It was a beautiful, terrifying mechanical predator, banking hard over the southern rim of the valley. But as the pilot flared the nose to stabilize his aim, a realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. One helicopter couldn't clear 2 miles of mountain ridges. This was a band-aid on a severed artery. "Command, I see the bird," Sarah signaled, her eyes never leaving the insurgent line. "But one Apache isn't enough. The ridges are crawling. If he goes low to help us, they'll chew him up with RPGs from the high ground." The pilot's voice broke into her ear, frantic and strained. "Ghost Lead, this is Gunship 1-1. I'm bingo on fuel and low on ordnance. I was diverted from a local patrol. I don't have the authorization for a full sector sweep. I can give you 1 pass. Make it count." 1 pass. 45 minutes of waiting, and the most advanced army in the world could only spare 1 pass for a convoy of 100 souls. It was the ultimate price of arrogance. Major Harrison and his staff had gambled with the horizontal logic of their maps, and now they were losing the house. "Jenkins, get the signal smoke," Sarah ordered. "Mark the tanker. If the pilot hits that wreck, it might create a barrier and buy us time to pull the survivors back." Jenkins, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the canister, fumbled with the pin. He threw the yellow smoke just as a fresh wave of insurgents breached the 20-yard mark. The yellow cloud billowed up, thick and sulfurous, mixing with the black smoke of the burning fuel. The Apache dived. The sound was a roar of gods. The 30mm chain gun beneath the pilot's nose began to cycle, brrrt, 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 shredding the rocks where the insurgents had been sliding down. For 10 seconds, it looked like the tide had turned. The insurgents were erased from the slope in a hail of high-explosive rounds. But then, the mountain spoke back. From a hidden cave mouth on the opposite ridge, a spot completely invisible to satellite thermals, 3 streaks of light ignited. Man-portable air defense systems, man-pads, heat-seeking missiles. "Break! Break! Break!" Sarah screamed, but the Apache was too low, trapped in the same narrow funnel as the convoy. The pilot popped flares, brilliant white stars of magnesium raining down into the valley, but the mountains were too narrow. The missiles didn't have to track the heat perfectly, they just had to explode near the stone walls. The shock wave and shrapnel did the rest. The Apache's tail rotor was clipped by a jagged piece of the mountain wall. The bird began to spin, its graceful predatory stance turning into a chaotic metal death spiral. It slammed into the cliffside halfway between the ridge and the road, exploding in a fireball that lit up the entire pass. The silence that followed was the most sickening sound Sarah had ever heard. The help was gone. The air cover was now just another burning wreck added to the pile. "They're laughing," Jenkins whispered, his voice cracking. "Listen to them." From the ridges above, the insurgents were indeed cheering.
Their shouts echoed through the valley, a mocking sound that seemed to come from the very ghosts of 1953. They had proven it again. Technology is nothing if the strategy is stupid. Arrogance had led a billion-dollar machine into a trap that $1,000 missile could destroy. Sarah looked down at her hands. They were covered in soot and Jenkins' blood. She looked at the convoy. The rear trucks were now being swarmed. She could see soldiers being pulled from their cabs. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was an execution. $4 trillion, Sarah hissed, her eyes turning into cold flint. All that money, and they didn't buy a single history book.
She stood up. She wasn't hiding behind the engine block anymore. She picked up a discarded M4 rifle from a fallen soldier, slung her sniper rifle over her back, and looked at the few survivors huddled under the lead Humvee. "If we wait for Harrison, we die," Sarah said, her voice echoing with a cold authority that the TOC could never understand. "If we wait for the 45-minute QRF, we're prisoners or corpses. We are going to do what the French couldn't. We're going to stop trying to win the map and start winning the ground. We're going to punch through that fire, or we're going to die trying. Jenkins, get up. It's time to show them why you never trap a ghost in a valley." She didn't wait for a reply. She stepped out into the open, the light of the two burning wrecks, the tanker and the Apache, casting her shadow long and sharp against the ancient stone walls. The final lesson of the Al-Zab Pass was about to begin. The Al-Zab Pass had become a landscape of nightmares. The wreckage of the Apache gunship still burned on the cliffside, its mangled blades glowing like embers, while the 507's fuel tanker created a wall of fire that licked at the sky. Sarah Miller stood at the center of this chaos. She no longer felt the heat, the thirst, or the fear. She only felt the weight of the rifle in her hand and the crushing reality of history. "They think they've won," Sarah said, her voice cutting through Jenkins' quiet sobbing. "They think we're just another statistic for their propaganda videos. They think they can repeat 1953 and 2003 because our commanders were too arrogant to look back. But they forgot one thing." She looked at the few remaining soldiers, tired, wounded, and abandoned by the vertical logic of the TOC. They forgot that a valley is only a trap if you stay in the bottom of it. Sarah pointed to the western ridge. It was a steep, jagged climb, but the smoke from the burning Apache was blowing toward it, creating a thick, black screen. "We aren't waiting for the QRF. We aren't waiting for the 45-minute miracle that isn't coming. We're going to use that smoke as cover. We're going to climb that ridge, and we're going to take the high ground back. We fight our way out, or we die on our feet." Jenkins looked up, the yellow smoke from the signaling canister still staining his face. "Ghost, we can't climb that. We're in full kit." "Drop the kit," Sarah commanded. "Keep your ammo, your water, and your weapon. Everything else stays here. If Harrison wants his $4 trillion equipment, he can come get it himself." As they stripped their heavy ceramic plates and packs, Sarah moved to the front of the line. She was Ghost for a reason. She knew the silence of the mountains better than the insurgents did. She led the survivors through the thick, choking plume of the Apache's wreckage. The heat was unbearable, the smoke stinging their lungs, but it was their only shield. They began to climb. It was a brutal, vertical scramble. Their fingers bled as they gripped the sharp limestone. Below them, they could hear the insurgents moving onto the road, looting the trucks and shouting in triumph. The enemy was so focused on the soft targets in the valley that they never expected the prey to climb the walls. Halfway up, Sarah signaled for a halt. She pulled her .338 Lapua from her back. She found a stable ledge and looked down. From this height, she could see the entire trap. She saw the insurgent leaders standing near the burning tanker, laughing and posing for photos with captured American gear. "History's lesson is about to change," Sarah whispered. She didn't just fire, she hunted.
With the silence of a ghost and the precision of a surgeon, she began to pick off the leaders. Thump! The man with the megaphone fell. Thump! The insurgent holding the manpads launcher vanished. Thump! The man filming the scene dropped his camera. Panic erupted below. The insurgents, who had felt so safe in their high-ground victory, were now being fired upon from even higher ground. They scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to hide in the open valley floor. They were now the ones trapped in the funnel.
Sarah's survivors reached the summit just as the sound of distant, heavy rotors finally filled the air. This time, it wasn't a lone bird. It was the full weight of a quick reaction force, 3 Chinooks escorted by 4 Cobras. Major Harrison had finally been forced to listen. The 45 minutes were up, but the battle had already been won by a woman who refused to be a footnote. The rescue was a whirlwind of dust and thunder. As the Cobras shredded the remaining insurgent positions, the Chinooks touched down on the ridge. Sarah didn't run to the helicopters. She stood on the edge of the cliff, looking down at the burning graveyard of the 507th. She saw the rusting French helmet she had imagined earlier, a symbol of every soldier betrayed by the arrogance of leadership. She realized that the $4 trillion spent hadn't bought victory. It had only bought the opportunity to make the same mistakes again. As the medic pulled her toward the ramp of the Chinook, Sarah looked at her watch. It had been exactly 1 hour since the first shot was fired. 1 hour to lose a convoy. 1 hour to lose a gunship. 1 hour to prove that history is a circle for those who don't know it and a ladder for those who do. The helicopter lifted off, banking away from the Al-Zab pass. As Sarah looked down, the valley was once again shrouded in shadows and smoke. She closed her eyes, the faces of the fallen from Nasiriyah and Dien Bien Phu flickering in her mind. "Never again," she whispered, though she knew the arrogance of men like Harrison would likely try to repeat it tomorrow. Sarah Miller survived the Al-Zab pass, but the scars of that valley remain. This story isn't just about a sniper, it's a warning. From the jungles of Vietnam in 1953 to the streets of Iraq in 2003 and the mountains of today, the cost of arrogance is always paid by the soldier on the ground. When commanders forget history, they condemn their troops to repeat it. If you believe we need to learn from our past before we lose our future, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us tell the stories that the arrogant commanders would rather keep buried. And tell us in the comments, do you think modern military leadership has truly learned the lessons of the past, or are we just waiting for the next Dien Bien Phu? Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next mission.